Chapter 3, Lesson 4, Dividing Rational Numbers. Before we start dividing, we need to talk about what the multiplicative inverse means. The multiplicative inverse states that the product of a number and its multiplicative inverse equals 1. So it's when we take a number and we find something that we can multiply it by to give us 1. So as an example, if I have 2/3 and I multiply it by 3/2, that will give me 6/6 or 1. Okay? We normally refer to this as the reciprocal. We say that 2/3 and 3/2 are reciprocals. So reciprocal is really just another word for multiplicative inverse, but it's the word that we use more often. Okay? Now let's look at how we find the reciprocal. It's fairly easy to find the reciprocal. We just switch the numerator and the denominator. Okay? But we need to put a little note here. We have to remember to never use mixed numbers to try to find a reciprocal. We need to change to improper fractions. So we can only find the reciprocal when we have improper fractions. Alright, so let's look at some examples. The reciprocal of 2/5 is very simple. You just switch the numerator and denominator. Alright, -1/5. Negative reciprocals are the same thing. If it's negative, we multiply by -1 because we're trying to get an answer of +1. It would be -5/1, which would just be -5. Okay, the reciprocal of -3. The first thing you have to say is, well, that's the same as 3/1. So my reciprocal is -1/3. Okay, 3/2. We have to say, well, first I need to change it to improper. So I have 7/2. So the reciprocal is 2/7. When I am dividing fractions is what I'm really doing. We'll talk about KFC. But what I'm really doing is instead of dividing, I multiply by the reciprocal. All right, and a little way to remember that is KFC. The first thing we do is we keep the first fraction. We keep it exactly as it is. The only thing we need to make sure we do is maybe change it to an improper fraction. The second thing we're going to do is we are going to flip the second fraction. So we are going to be making it into the reciprocal. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to change the division sign to a multiplication sign. We want to put a little note here, only improper fractions. If we have any mixed numbers, we must change them first. All right, let's look at some examples. So we're going to keep the first fraction, flip the second, and change the sign. And then I just multiply normally. I can divide the 9 and 12 both by 3, and I get 4/15. All right, let's look at now some more complicated ones. First thing I need to do is I need to say, okay, -4 2/3. That's 14/3, and we're dividing that by 28/9. Don't try to do all this in one step. Now we're going to keep the first, flip the second, and change the sign. Then I'm going to simplify, divide those both by 14, and I get 3/2. Negative times positive, my answer is negative. I can leave it like that, or I can change it to -1.5. Okay, if I have 3/4 divided by 11, that's the same thing as 3/4 divided by 11/1. So I keep the first, flip the second, change the sign, and my answer is 3 over 44. Now let's look at something a little bit different. When we are multiplying and dividing algebraic fractions, we do it the same way, but we're not going to have so many numbers we can cancel. What we're going to look for is we're going to cancel common factors. Okay? Remember that if I have A, B, and C, A is a factor, B is a factor, and C is a factor, because it's like A times B times C. All right, so we're going to look for common factors to cancel. So for example, if I have 5 over 3AB divided by 15 over ABC, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to keep, I'm going to flip, and I'm going to change. Now remember, when I multiply, I can cross-simplify. It's very important here. So I say, okay, 5 and 15. Cross-simplify your numbers normally. Divide them both by 5. And then say, well, there's a factor of an A here, and there's a factor of an A here. So I can say, well, let me cancel my A's. I can also cancel a B because they both have a factor of a B. And then I multiply, so I have left over 1 times C, which is C, and I have 3 times 3, which is 9. All right, and down on this last example, I say, okay, my 5 and 10, I can divide both by 5. They also both have a factor of a B, so I can divide them both by B, and it gives me a 1. And I'm ready to multiply. So I multiply across the top. 1 times A times 7 gives me 7A, and 6 times 2 gives me 12.